Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we're talking about the new Ex Deo album, which should be kind of weird and funky and cool and exciting, because guess what? Somehow, this is actually the first time I'm even hearing about Ex Deo. Yeah, weird to think, but somehow, despite my love of Canadian metal, despite the fact that this features several current members of Kataklysm, an iconic French-Canadian death metal band, I've somehow never heard of this symphonic melodic death metal crew, and as such, have never heard a full studio album. They completely evaded my gaze. I'm not really even sure how, but it doesn't matter. And the good news is, this means we can all explore some brand new music together. So let's do that right the fuck now. The 13 Years of Nero is the fourth studio album from this Canadian melodic and symphonic death metal side project, headed up by Kataklysm alumni, including Maurizio Icano on lead vocals, and Stéphane Barbe and Jean-François Dagenais on guitars. And yes, I'm well aware I butchered all of those names, so don't bother fucking telling me. This particular record, at least according to a description on Bandcamp, transports the listener back to ancient Rome with 10 cinematic masterpieces that tell the emotional conceptual story of the reign of Emperor Nero. Accented by sounds of ancient instruments like lyra and harp and detailing the harrowing stories of Nero's surroundings, close allies, and enemies, listeners will connect with intense psychological tones of political turmoil and paranoia. Right off the bat, this information about the story pulling from real history, coupled with what we already know sonically of Ex Deo, sets the stage for a monumental affair. A high-concept, historically accurate epic for the ages, cram-packed with cinematic bluster and orchestral bombast, very much melodic death metal's answer to something like Carolus Rex, from Sabaton, if you will. Top that off with the assertion, the implication that this music is masterful, to paraphrase Ex Deo themselves, and yeah, it's hard not to go into this record with pretty high expectations. For the most part, musically, what we're dealing with is a lot of hefty, groove-laden, mid-pace melodic death metal, coupled with a lot of orchestral segments and arrangements, a lot of keyboards, strings, woodwinds, trumpets, loud, blaring, thunderous percussion. Think the production, the symphonic metal stylings of Septic Flesh, Flesh God Apocalypse, arguably Cradle of Filth, but applied to the more basic meat and potatoes savagery of a band like Amon Amarth, and to some extent, yes, even Kataklysm. The track Imperator is a great example of everything I'm talking about. It's a very dark and brooding and intentionally somewhat monotonous track with a lot of slow churning dirgy grooves, building tension on some really dark and heavy string work and some venomous vocals. Images of an army marching off to their impending doom, or perhaps even the aftermath of their battle, are immediately brought to mind. There's also the Fiddle and Fire, which takes things to the next level, slowing things down big time and introducing some harps and some more string instruments. It's a very evocative and moody cut, genuinely kind of dark and disturbing, particularly with some spoken word vocals that make this genuinely a little creepy. When contrasted with big walls of symphonic bluster and these almost black metal kind of percussive beatdowns, it makes for a genuinely punishing display. Now, as the album goes on, I will admit that the formula begins to lose a little bit of its luster, a little bit of its impact, as the band continue to repeat and recycle all kinds of different tricks and tactics, but for the most part, it's still relatively effective. Like, by the time we get to the closing number, The Revolt of Galba, I'm still headbanging, I'm still having fun. And to Ex Deo's credit, there are a few subtle spices here and there that do make a world of difference. The track Boudica, for instance, has an absolutely fantastic vocal performance from Brittany Slays of Unleash the Archers fame. Her performance is so good, honestly, that it, for a moment, almost backfires on the band. Like, after this number, I'm sitting here going, why the fuck isn't she featured more on this album? And for that matter, why aren't there more guest spots on this album? Like, she's clearly playing a character. This is clearly a big, epic story. why aren't there more people involved? Which does, now that I think of it, bring up a legitimate concern I have with this album. There's a lot of information you constantly have to swallow and process, not just musically, but conceptually as well. I mean, we're dealing with the life and the full reign of a Roman emperor. There's a lot of war, a lot of betrayal, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of bitter and divisive politics, a lot of history. And honestly, the album doesn't really do a good job at clearly and thoroughly explaining that history. I find myself being kind of confused throughout a majority of this album's runtime. Maybe it's just because I don't know a lot about Roman history. Believe it or not, this is not something that we broadly talked about in Canadian high school in our Canadian history class. I will concede I am uneducated on Roman history as a result. But, you know, it's a concept album. It's a story. I should leave the concept album understanding the story, or at least understanding enough of it that I can fill in some of the gaps myself. If at any point following your story, unless it's a sequel or connected to some MCU-style universe, I feel the need to do homework afterwards, you have failed on some level, plain and simple. On top of that, the overall production, the sound mix specifically, is pretty soupy and inconsistent. I find a lot of the guitar stuff, for instance, often just kind of blurs into a muddy, noisy mess, and when it isn't, it's just kind of pushed out of the spotlight entirely by a lot of loud, blaring orchestration and string work. On top of that, Maurizio's very high-pitched, nasally vocals are a touch awkward. It feels like he's doing a very half-assed kind of Danny Filth impersonation sometimes, but even his regular gutturals just lack the punch and clarity of what I might expect from, say, a Kataklysm record. And honestly, despite being only 48 minutes long, I can't help but get the feeling that this album is weirdly somewhat bloated and fatty. At the very least, I think each track could do with maybe half a minute being trimmed off, or perhaps just cut the Trial of the Gods intermission in its entirety, because that shit just sounds lame as fuck to begin with, if we're being entirely honest. There's a lot that I admire and appreciate and respect about the 13 Years of Nero. Let's make that perfectly fucking clear. And there's a lot of music that I genuinely find myself enjoying because of that. But there's also a lot of stuff that holds this album back from greatness, as we've discussed. And as a result, I don't find myself coming back to this album as often as I would a Kataklysm record, or as I would records from Septic Flesh, or Flesh God Apocalypse, or a multitude of the other bands that we've name-dropped in this review. It's ambitious, but perhaps too ambitious for its own good. Too busy, too, dare I say, pretentious, and as a result, I think I'd have to give this a 2.5 out of 5. A somewhat enthusiastic one, mind you, because again, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here, but a 2.5 out of 5 nonetheless. I'm not really sure how Ex Deo fans would feel about this, because again, I really don't know much about these guys, but I can picture fans of symphonic and melodic death metal jamming with this. I can picture Kataklysm fans jamming with this. And I can picture history nerds who are just looking for something kind of funky and something kind of different, having some fun ever so briefly with this. While I'm not super pumped to return to 13 Years of Nero, I'm now interested enough in Ex Deo that I'm willing to check out some other albums in their discography, and that itself is kind of a victory if you think about it. So yeah, it's interesting, it's intelligent, it's occasionally pretty fucking fun, but any album that requires me to do homework afterwards has failed on some level. Couple that with a pretty spotty, soupy, inconsistent sound mix, and you have something that could have been great, but just kind of ends up being okay, you know? It's just okay. Whatever. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown e-fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.